Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus. I have got the most phenomenal story for you tonight, coming from Chloe from Portland, who shares with us an extraordinary supernatural experience she had with a Bigfoot in Mount Shasta. Now, we do know that Mount Shasta is definitely steeped in the supernatural. It's an area of incredible mysterious happenings that have been unexplained. People have had incredible encounters in Mount Shasta, and paranormal investigators tend to say that you're likely to have an experience there if you're not expecting it and if you're alone. Anyway, she gives us an incredible account of what happened to us that gives us another look or another perspective of Bigfoot encounters, and I think you're going to find it incredibly interesting. But before we get started, I just want to thank all my subscribers in North America and around the world for your continued support. And I love you guys so very much. You are very special to me. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because I want to tell you so many secrets are coming out of the woodwork. People who've been sitting on their Bigfoot secrets for many long years, afraid to share them, are finally coming out and revealing the most incredible stories. And I don't want you to miss out on those stories. They're so grateful to have this anonymous forum to express those stories in, because they don't want us to be able to identify who they are. Remaining anonymous is so important to them, which I truly understand, given the reaction that Bigfoot encounters can have on an unbelieving public. So let's get started. I know you're going to love the story. Dear Sarah, my name is Chloe and I'm from Portland. My Bigfoot experience happened to me in 2015 when I visited Mount Shasta with my best friend Judy. Judy has always been fascinated by the supernatural, which was something that I never believed in myself. Some of the stories she would tell me about, with strange things and strange happenings that occurred to people, I found both entertaining and interesting, but never for a moment did I ever believe those stories. I would not describe myself as a hardened cynic, because I rarely wanted to believe her stories, but it was such a struggle for me to overcome my inevitable doubts. Before I tell you my story, I would like your listeners to learn about Mount Shasta in the first place, because it is of great significance to my story and the strange phenomena that occurred on the mountain to me personally that I can only describe as utterly supernatural. Mount Shasta is a premier landmark in Northern Carolina and Southern Oregon. It is the second largest mountain in the Cascade Range behind Mount Rainier, and it stands at 14,179 feet. Its glorious volcanic eruptions are what initiated the creation of those awesome snow-capped mountains that can be visibly seen and that Mount Shasta is so revered for. Even though it's a volcano, it lies dormant and has remained like an unexploded firework for a very long time. But it still has the potential to erupt again. Shasta has a beautiful rugged outcrop shimmering silvery lakes, mountain streams, dramatic waterfalls, glaciers, scenic vistas and cabins in varying sizes. However, what sets Mount Shasta apart from any other mountain range in the whole wide world is that it is steeped and cloaked in intriguing mysteries and stories of the supernatural, with extraordinary excitings from ascended masters to Bigfoot himself. Its ominous aura holds a plethora of deep, dark secrets that may never be uncovered or ever explained. According to legend, it is the home of spirits, gods, fairies, Bigfoot, cryptid creatures, strange orbs, UFOs, Lemurians, occultists, secret underground bases, and mysterious tunnels. You may be wondering why Judy and I went to Mount Shasta in the first place, and that's a very good question. It was because Judy was on her spiritual odyssey. Well, that's how she describes it at the time. This friend of mine was very unusual in everything. Everything about her was so different, from her bohemian clothes to her carefree attitude about life. She wanted to go to Mount Shasta to have an encounter with an ascended master that she called St. Germain, who she was hoping would appear to her and reveal some secrets to her from within the mountain. She told me that there were cases of people who were spiritually advanced who had indeed encountered St. Germain on the mountain during a meditation. She wanted me to accompany her on the trip, which was amusing to say the least, because much as I loved Judy, I did not believe in all her crazy ideas about the supernatural. However, I decided I would accompany her on the trip because I enjoy her company, and I knew that a little hiking up the mountain, some lovely fresh mountain air, and some beautiful scenery would do me no end of good. So that's what I did. We decided to book a 10-day trip at a bed and breakfast in the area. We would have fun exploring the mountain, visiting the lake, and visiting the town of Mount Shasta, and doing a little souvenir shopping there, and buying some interesting curios. It was going to be heaps of fun for us, and the idea of it all made me extremely excited. Fast forward to our drive on Interstate 5 North, very near Mount Shasta. Driving along this interstate was truly a sight to behold, because the views of Mount Shasta were breathtakingly beautiful, with ubiquitous trees and blue sky. I was in the driving seat of my red Jeep, really enjoying the scenic drive, when quite suddenly I nearly ran over this young woman in the road. "Stop!" screamed Chloe. "Stop, for goodness sake!" I slammed down the brakes as hard as I could, wondering all the while why on earth this young girl was standing in the middle of the road. I slid down my car window and called out to the girl, asking if she was all right, as I watched her limping across the road. The girl looked flustered. "You nearly ran me over," she scolded. I knew I could not argue with that, but what on earth had she been doing in the middle of the road? I thought privately to myself. I was too polite to challenge her, but I offered her a lift, and she was pleased to accept my offer. I watched her slide into the back seat. I would say she was about 18, and she had very wild blonde hair that was full of those spirally curls that are typical of those spiral perms that come from the 80s era. She was wearing very light Levi jeans with pink leg warmers, white sneakers, and a pink pleated blouse with large shoulder pads. I thought she looked quite smart as I watched her climb into the back seat, secretly wondering why she was wandering on the interstate all on her own. "Are you from around here?" I asked her. "Goodness no," she said. "I'm from Alabama. I'm out here to enjoy Mount Shasta." I agreed with her that Mount Shasta was exceedingly beautiful. I sensed she was very guarded, so I decided not to ask her too many questions, and I proceeded to raise the volume of my radio in the car, and we started listening to our favourite songs, bobbing up and down in our seats, and singing the songs we knew well. Chloe spontaneously reached for a big bag of crunchy beef-flavoured crisps, and turned around to offer the girl some of the snacks, and then she freaked out because the girl had simply vanished, and there was no way she could have got out of the car with child locks in it. So where on earth had she gone? This was my first supernatural experience, because I knew we must have encountered a ghost. Chloe believed that maybe she'd been killed in a car accident around the Mount Shasta area in the 80s because of the way she was dressed. I found out later that other people had reported ghostly phenomena in this area that they believed were the apparitions of victims of road crashes. It was hard for the cynic in me to accept what had happened, because we had picked up this girl during the day and she had appeared as real as you and I. The experience was hauntingly unsettling. I also never imagined it was possible to encounter a ghost during the day, because paranormal researchers go after the supernatural phenomenon during the night, do they not? So a daytime sighting was peculiar, but there was no explanation on how this girl got out of a locked car that has child locks on it. It was physically impossible, but supernaturally very possible. We arrived at our bed and breakfast spot, which was a house situated down a long driveway that was tucked away in the woods, surrounded by ubiquitous trees and plenty of rambling foliage. Chloe and I settled into our very large bedroom that was both spacious and airy and clean. There was a big poster on the wall of a humanoid-looking ape with writing under it saying, "Is Bigfoot real?" with a huge question mark after it. "What is Bigfoot?" I asked Chloe curiously. Chloe did not know much about Bigfoot, but she said he was a cryptid creature that some people believed was real. I broached the subject with our very friendly host who runs the bed and breakfast, and he said that they had experienced a lot of Bigfoot activity on the premises, and that the guest had sometimes complained of loud banging noises on the gates, and some of the guests had left out food for the Bigfoots, only to find that the food had been eaten the following morning when they went back to the gifting area. He said if we listened carefully, we might hear whooping sounds during the night. We never got to hear Bigfoot whooping that the host had described, and I began to wonder if he made all this stuff up for the people who are interested in encountering Bigfoot, because Chloe had told me there were TV programs dedicated to searching for these cryptid creatures. After all, I thought, if he said he was having encounters on the premises, people would book his Airbnb all the time in the hope that they themselves would get a sighting of the creature. I expressed my thoughts to Chloe, who believed that the man would never have made something up like that. I wasn't so sure. The following day we dressed up in our hiking gear and proceeded to Bunny Flat, where I parked my jeep to begin the hike. We were not intending to venture far up the mountain slopes, because all Chloe wanted to do was to meditate in the hope of meeting the ascended master, St. Germain, which I thought was crazy, but I was not going to express my feelings on the matter. We walked 1 mile and came to Horse Camp, which is the last stop where you can get a drink of yellowish spring water that is so full of electrolytes. By the way, as far as water goes, this stuff was amazingly refreshing and surprisingly energizing. Maybe it's something to do with the energy around Mount Shasta that possibly energizes the water. This was also the spot for a civilized toilet break and a sneak look at the library there. As we proceeded further towards Mount Helen, that was when Chloe found the perfect spot where she wanted to meditate, and she told me to leave her alone at this point because her meditation needed to be done strictly in private. Otherwise, St. Germain was very unlikely to appear to her. I watched her unroll her pink yoga mat and sit in a yoga stance with her palms facing upwards and her eyes closed tightly as she started humming her various mantras. My word, I thought, she really does take all this yogi stuff seriously. But I knew in my heart she would not see St. Germain, because as far as I was concerned, he didn't exist, but I wasn't going to be telling her that. I was not sure how long she was going to be, and as I was all on my own, I would need to keep myself busy, so I had come armed and prepared with a few snacks and drinks in my backpack, a comfortable picnic blanket, a really good book that I'd been planning to read for a very long time, but I'd always been too distracted to actually get into it. At this point, I would like to mention that despite the fact that I had my doubts about the supernatural, there definitely was a palpable energy about Mount Shasta that I cannot explain and was physically very tangible. I would also like to mention that paranormal investigators have always said that to get a supernatural experience on Mount Shasta, it usually happens when you're not expecting it and also when you're alone, 2 criteria that I clearly met on that day but was oblivious about at the time. It was after about 15 minutes as I was reading my book that I heard this very strange, piercing kind of whistling, and I put my book down wondering if there was another hiker around. What I saw at that moment was not what I was expecting to see at all. A 7-foot-tall, 600-pound humanoid ape man was standing several yards away from me, but he was close enough for me to see him very, very clearly. I could hardly believe what I was seeing with my eyes, because it was Bigfoot himself, the creature I'd seen on the poster the previous night. I think the three things that caught my eyes about this Bigfoot was his incredibly large torso, his chunky shoulders, and his bullet-shaped head, as well as his humongous feet and very, very long arms. The creature whistled, looked at me and turned away suddenly, and then he proceeded to get down on all fours like a dog. But then his body suddenly morphed into a wolf, all in front of me, and then again it started to morph once again into a large black panther. As the creature shape-shifted from one animal to another before my very eyes, the one thing that never changed was his Bigfoot feet, so the transformations of the Bigfoot and these other creatures was very comical. Try and imagine a Bigfoot's foot on a wolf followed by a Bigfoot's foot on a black panther. Well, that's exactly what I saw. I watched the creature rise again and shapeshift into his original Bigfoot form and dart off. While he did this, the creature turned around one last time and looked at me through his seemingly friendly brown eyes. At that precise moment, an audible voice in my head literally said these three words that I will never forget as long as I live. The words I heard were, "More things are real than you know." I watched the creature glide off on his long legs with the agility and speed of a cheetah. I stood there for a moment feeling so dazed and shocked by what I had seen, and the words the creature spoke to me telepathically were going over and over in my mind like a washing machine in full cycle. Did this creature know that I did not believe in him or any of this supernatural stuff? Was this why the creature challenged my skepticism and handed me a plateful of supernatural vegetables to digest? That is clearly what happened, and it seemed like the creature had a sense of humour too. I could hardly wait to see Chloe, who seemed to be taking her time with all her meditation. I wanted to tell her about my mysterious encounter with the hairy man, but when I saw her downcast face coming towards me, I decided to hold back my exciting revelations. It seemed like Saint-Germain had not appeared to Chloe, as I had anticipated, and she looked utterly devastated. I could see the tears rolling down her face, and she started to sob uncontrollably. You know how long I've been waiting to do this meditation? I've been planning this for so long, and nothing happens, and I think I know why. I knew she was eliciting a response from me, so I dutifully asked her why she thought this was the case. It's because I'm emotionally and spiritually immature, so much so that the likes of someone as enlightened as Saint-Germain would never appear to me. It was egotistical and arrogant of me to think that he would. I did not know what to say to that, but I did remind her of the ghostly encounter the ghostly girl we had picked up on the Interstate 5. I reminded her that we had experienced something paranormal, and that finally did lift her mood. The rest of the trip we did a lot of shopping at Mount Shasta. We drank thick chocolate milkshakes and ate plenty of carrot cake in the coffee shop there. We had meals at different locations, and we went for hikes around lakes and watched beautiful golden sunsets. And all in all, we had the most fantastic time, and it was a holiday I wouldn't have missed for the world, that I highly recommend to any of your listeners. All this time I was longing to tell Chloe my experience, but I just never had the heart to, because Mount Shasta spiritual retreat was a big deal to her, and I'd only tagged along for the ride. Yet it was I that had had the supernatural experience, and not her. Some might say I saw a skinwalker because of the shape-shifting, but I do believe I saw a Bigfoot because the feet of the Bigfoot never changed once. I believe I had the experience because of my doubting mentality that has clouded my life with skepticism and disbelief for so very long. So if you are like I was once, remember what the Bigfoot told me. More things are real than you know. Oh my word, I am blown away by that story. Thank you so much for sending it. Let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Paul, and I've been a sheep farmer for over 20 long years now at my farm here in Corvallis in Oregon. I grew up on this farm all my life, which belonged to my late father until he died in 1995. And being his only son, I naturally, very fortunately, inherited the land. I also, along the way, got a degree in animal science when I was younger, which has helped me considerably become the knowledge, experienced sheep farmer that I am today. I am married to a beautiful woman called Hattie, and I have 2 young boys, Robert 19 and Jason 17. I have had various experience with Bigfoot over my life, and so I will tell you about those encounters. But before I do, let me describe the rural setting where I live, so that your listeners can paint a picture in their minds of my sheep farm and the location of my Bigfoot experience. I live in a visually stunning location in an old 1880s farmhouse that my father restored to pristine perfection when I was a young boy. Over the years, I've done some renovations of my own to the house, and so I have managed to keep the historic integrity of the place, I'm glad to say. On my farm currently, I have about 280 lambs and 190 ewes, and the sheep that I farm are known as hair sheep because they do not require sharing, which for me would be a laborious job to do because it requires a very skilled professional hand and it needs to be done exceedingly fast. My sheep shed their hair naturally once a year, but the meat from my sheep is mild and extremely tender, and believe me, they taste delicious. Of course, it does help to give your animals the best nutrition possible with all the necessary minerals like selenium and zinc, because this ensures the health and vitality of the sheep and also the quality and the taste of the meat. I have what I call a rotational feeding system as far as the grazing is concerned, which means that certain pastures are rested for only 45 days before the sheep can graze there again. This gives the rested grazing land a chance to regenerate and revive itself before it is grazed again. I seeded my pasture again 5 years ago, using different grasses like lush orchard grasses, including spreading grasses like red clover, and so I've enhanced their diet considerably. I never give my sheep grain, but they have a porridge-based diet and a high-quality hay, especially during the winter months. I also have a solar-powered watering system, which is fantastic on my land, and I have 2 Pyrenees dogs that stay and look after the lambs and sheep, protecting them from predators like coyotes, and they are brilliant at their jobs. They never leave the land. I have a lot of grazing land on my property for sheep, but I also have a lake and a pond on the land as well as a forest that stretches back for many miles. The views of the stunning rolling countryside and magnificent mountain valleys are utterly spectacular and breathtaking, and I consider myself remarkably privileged to live in such an idyllic country setting. You should see the golden sunsets on my land, as they truly are a sight to behold, and a gentle reminder of why I do this work. Over the years, we were aware of strange whooping sounds from the valley that definitely sounded like primate calls. I don't think they could have been anything else. And we could hear these calls being answered back on the other side of the valley. We would also get to hear wood knocks very frequently, and we still do today. And from time to time, we would hear banging around our own home. When my dad did renovate our property when I was a young boy, that was when the banging increased intensely. At first, my mother thought the property was haunted because of the renovations that she believed had energized the spirits of previous owners of our property. However, we were to find strange boulders outside our outbuildings that something had thrown at us during the night. We also got to see huge 16-inch footprints in the mud around our land. That, however, did not stop my mother from calling in a team of paranormal investigators to test the property for spirits. But luckily, there was no sign of activity. At first, my father thought those footprints we had seen must have belonged to a bear. Luckily, the activity eventually did die down, although we did have a mysterious event when one day a bag of oats vanished from an outbuilding and the door had been broken down by something exceedingly big. Of course, my father thought we had been robbed, but none of our expensive farming equipment had been seized. One day when I was playing by the lake as a young boy, I do remember seeing what I believe was a bear standing in the water with its back turned away from me. Its body was just covered in brown hair with silver root tops, and it was only when I saw it grabbing a frog which it started to eat that I realized it wasn't a bear, because it had hands like we do and not paws. I remember how terrified I was of this creature. It truly was an apex predator, and it had an incredible presence about it, something that you just do not forget. My heart was pounding and my whole body was shaking and trembling because I could see that this creature could potentially kill me and could be more brutal than a bear. I knew it could snap my neck just like it did a twig. I remember hiding and watching the thing behind a little bush. For a moment, in terror, I thought it had detected me by the way it was sniffing the air with its nose, as if it had got a whiff of my scent. If it knew I was there, it still left me alone, but it did seem to make a hasty retreat to the forest line and glance several times over its shoulders in my direction. For a moment I did get a brief view of the creature's long humanoid face. Luckily it never saw me, but I did watch it glide very gracefully into the woody area, and it was so incredibly flawless the way it moved, and it was so fast, almost equaling to the gallop of a horse on those long, lean, muscular legs. I always remember that I never told my father what I'd seen, because I knew he would think I was making it up, as we had never heard of creatures like this before. One day we heard a strange noise outside our front door, and two of our Pyrenees dogs that always stayed with the sheep were scratching on the door to be let in. They behaved in such a strange way and were whimpering and yelping in terror. They were cowering in fear, so we knew something was very wrong because they had never behaved like that before, and they never left the sheep unattended. My father dashed over to the sheep pasture with his rifle in hand, and when he came back he said that there was the most intolerable smell in the area that he could not describe, but it was very sulphurous and disgusting. He also said that there were 3 sheep that had vanished mysteriously without a trace, although he had found some spilled blood on the grass, and it looked as if it was leading to the wooded area on our land. He found a strange bundle of brown human-like hair that had snagged itself on a nearby tree branch. It was all very odd, but in my childlike mind, I was almost certain it was the creature I had seen by the lake, eating a frog, that was responsible for this heinous crime. But believe it or not, I never breathed a word of it to my father. I think the thing that bewildered me most about the disappearing sheep was that the 2 Pyrenees dogs that faithfully guarded the sheep were so terrified of this predator, yet they were so brilliant at chasing after coyotes without any problems. So whatever had taken those sheep was an exceedingly dangerous predator, so much so that the Pyrenees dogs had been threatened with their very lives, and that I knew was definitely true. Luckily we had no more cases of sheep going missing on our farm after that, and over many years everything was relatively quiet, calm and normal, until one day when things changed dramatically. This was shortly after I'd taken over the farm from my dad, after he had sadly passed away 2 years after my mother. I always believed he died of a broken heart because he was so grieved over my mother's passing from pancreatic cancer. One day on my land, we were having major problems with about 60 or more coyotes on our property who were attacking all our sheep. Even though our Pyrenees dogs would chase after the coyotes, the problem was that they were outnumbered and outsmarted by these clever, crafty creatures. So while my dogs were chased after a few coyotes, the others would creep into the pasture and attack the sheep. These coyotes would kill my sheep swiftly by biting their throats just behind the jaw and below the ear. My dogs were utterly exhausted from the nightly activities and visits from the coyotes, and despite my dogs' best efforts, they had succeeded in taking down a few of our sheep. I knew I had to manage this situation, as these sheep are my livelihood, and I could not afford to lose them to the predators. So I planned a night hunt, and I got my 2 teenage sons involved in the plan because they loved hunting and were great with rifles. I also needed to use my epic thermal hunting tool to help me locate these creatures with thermal imagery. We did manage to take down 20 of these coyotes, and then my two sons suddenly saw these strange tall figures in the thermal with rarely huge girths and long arms standing in the forest line, watching the whole shootout. One of these creatures dropped to all fours like a dog and ran towards one of the dead coyotes scattered across the ground. I imagine this was to make himself smaller, and then he lowered himself onto the grass so that he became as flat as the ground, and then he wiggled his body forwards towards the dead coyote, which he grabbed, lifted on his shoulder, and then rose on two legs to a height of about 7 feet, and then proceeded to sprint right back to the forest line, then throwing the dead corpse of the coyote like a frisbee in the air, where it landed into one of the tall figure's arms. He kept repeating this process over and over again until every one of the tall figures had their own coyote in their arms. I imagine they were going to have quite a feast that night. I did not care that they had taken the coyotes because I knew what they were, but I did not tell my son in case he talked about it to his mates at school and got ridiculed for believing in Bigfoot. I know how easy it is for teenagers to get bullied, and these are the years when they can be remarkably sensitive. One boy at my son's school took his own life because the kids were teasing him about his acne and calling him Scarface. I cannot imagine what those poor parents went through when they found him hanging in the closet the next day. What a dreadful waste of a life, and how sad. I told my son that it was all a trick of the light and those creatures were all probably bears. They just accepted my word for it without challenging me, although I'm not sure that they actually believe me because my boys are incredibly bright. At the very least, I hope they've learnt not to mention the hairy man, because if the stigma gets attached to them, it may not do them any good. The next day I looked at the area where the creatures had crawled up to the coyote on all fours, and there was the most massive humanoid fist print in the ground, and the area smelt pretty rank, which was possibly the body odour from this Bigfoot. I have not seen one of these creatures' faces close up, only the side view of the face, but at a guess I would say they are 500 pounds and 6 to 7 feet tall. When I go into that wooded area, I have sometimes heard whistling in the woods and seen trees bent over in circular loops like some kind of marking, so I know they're still around. Also, when I go into the woods, whenever they become quiet and still, I know these things are there, because I can feel their eyes on me. So I do try to avoid the forests as much as I can. And that is my story. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for that incredible story. I love your description of being a sheep farmer and what it involves, because I've learned something new tonight, something I never knew before. And I didn't even know that you could get sheep that you couldn't really shear. So that's something that I've learned tonight, and I'm sure my listeners have too. So thank you so very much. And I love the way that those Bigfoot stole the coyotes and actually obviously had a good send-off together. My story tonight, the first one, comes from Stephen, who recently subscribed to my channel, and I'm really thankful to him for sending me his wonderful Bigfoot story, which I'm going to share with you tonight. The next story is from a letter that I got from a gentleman who actually worked with wild animals and had to go looking for a tiger that had escaped. And in doing his research to try and uncover this tiger, he uncovered the hairy man as well. So you're really going to enjoy both these stories. Let's get started. Dear Sarah, my name is Stephen, and I do not think I ever believed in Bigfoot before. I had heard people at work discussing the Blackwater Swamp Man, but the cynic in me rarely doubted their seemingly tall stories that appeared to be like a fabrication to me. I thought it was all done in jest to provide some light-hearted entertainment for the dudes at work. I was to find that the cynic in me was to be well and truly challenged by what I was about to see the next night, that would have repercussions on me that were so profound that my life would forever be changed quite dramatically. My story starts at the beginning of my usual humdrum work schedule, where I had a job working at the Smithfield Packing Company, which deals with general food supplies like pork products and stuff like that. Anyway, my job required lots of travelling backwards and forwards between both packing plants. Believe me, all the travelling can be extremely exhausting because you have to keep your eyes well and truly focused on that road. I stayed overnight in North Carolina and left the Bladen County plant at 6 p.m. and I travelled back home towards Smithfield. I remember how exhausted I was feeling that night, and I was so looking forward to returning home and finally putting my feet up. It was about 10:30 p.m. when thankfully I was driving down the final road of my journey on Interstate 620 to be precise. I took the side road between Cortland and Smithfield. Finally, to cut a long story short, I found myself driving past the Blackwater Swamp River. It was a beautiful clear night that was illuminated by a full moon, which meant that visibility on that night was exceedingly clear. Suddenly the moonlight accentuated that something that moved in the darkness that got my attention, almost 10 feet off the road towards my right. What I saw caused my hair to stand on end for a moment because whatever it was appeared to be exceedingly strange and totally out of place. At first I thought the figure was that of a man, but the dots just didn't add up, because this man was easily between 7 and 8 feet tall, and he was not wearing any clothes, but his whole body seemed to be covered in black hair that reminded me of a bear. Unfortunately, I did not get a look at the creature's face, which may have been a good thing judging by the way I was physically reacting to what I was seeing, that I do not mind admitting unnerved me to the core. This hairy humanoid being appeared to be in no hurry whatsoever, and I doubt he knew I'd even observed him at the river bottom. I want to tell you the effect he had on me to this very day has completely rattled me. I was unable to even speak of my experience to anyone, not even to my wife and kids, but this has profoundly changed my life. Now, almost 20 years later, I am convinced I saw a Squatch that night. Even today, my fascination for the hairy man lingers on, as is the case of many like myself who encounter this curious, elusive, and mysterious beast. Stephen, I just want to say that is an utterly phenomenal story, and I'm quite sure you encountered the Blackwater Swamp Man, and wow, we know he's real. That was just the most incredible story, and I have to say that it is amazing what the hairy man has, how he affects each and every one of us, and so much so that many of us are able to even share our encounters. So I'm very grateful that you shared us yours. I'm sure that all the listeners really appreciate your story, Stephen, so thank you very much. The next story is also going to be one that you're really going to love, and so let's get started. It comes to us from Wayne. He says here, "Dear Sarah, my name is Wayne, and I'm involved in wildlife conservation and rescue. It was in the early 80s that I was notified by the authorities about an escaped domesticated tiger that had been seen around the area and was causing all kinds of problems for the locals, who were very frightened about this animal. In my experience, domesticated tigers do tend to gravitate towards human beings because they tend to associate humans with easy food and play, because that's what they've always known. That's why a creature that is normally very elusive in the wild was seen by so many of the locals at the time, and they were terrified of this wild tiger harming or killing any of their children or pets. Farmers were also worried about the fate of their livestock, and so people were extremely concerned about their own personal safety. I was asked to track down this tiger and return it to the owners, because this was beyond being a police matter. The owners were absolutely devastated about their missing Bengal tiger, whom they called Molly, and they adored her. All the family interacted with the creature, and they said that she was very tame, that she would lie on the carpet next to the family when they watched television at night, and would go swimming in the pool with their teenager boy. They regarded the tiger as a member of the family that was really well loved and precious, and assured me that as long as the creature was respected, it would remain docile and affectionate. In my experience, a wild animal cannot be fully domesticated because there's always the potential of that wild, ingrained natural instinct that, if provoked unintentionally, could cause the creature to lash out and cause all kinds of damage. Worse still, if the creature was hungry, he could potentially be very, very dangerous. I cannot tell you where this happened for reasons of confidentiality in this matter. I will tell you that it was an area that was remote and rural, with thousands of square acres of natural forest, which is ideal for a tiger because they need lots of space. Ironically, these vast areas of North American wilderness were perfect for a large cat like a tiger, but not so ideal for someone tracking the creature because it could have been almost anywhere. For me, the first port of call was to go and speak to the people who had had recent sightings of the creature. The one thing I knew was that it would gravitate toward human beings, and this gave me the strong hope that we would be able to recapture the creature quite quickly. I went to visit all the locals in the area who had seen sightings of the tiger, and so I began to get a brief idea of whereabouts the creature might be. I had been tracking animals for years, so I knew exactly what to look out for. One family who contacted me said that they had not physically seen the tiger, but had seen the brush moving in the wooded area of their land, and that they had heard the sounds of huge, massive animals scouting around that had been growling at them and letting out the most aggressive and vicious roars. I decided to search the area, despite the fact that it was much further off the beaten path than the other sightings. Armed with a rifle that I always carried for my own personal protection, I navigated the forest in the way that any tracker would. Your senses have to be sensitive about everything around you so that you can observe everything as carefully as you can. What I saw left me with more questions than answers. Before I go into my story, I just want to stress that I had never ever heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch before at the time. Remember, it was in the 80s and the hairy man had not had the exposure that he's had now. In those days, most of our information was gleaned from libraries and encyclopedias, so we did not have the knowledge so heartily available today or accessible on our World Wide Web. It was not that I was not open to the idea of such cryptic creatures existing, but it was not something that I'd ever considered or conceived of before. In truth, there are so many areas of North American wilderness that have not been explored by man, so it wouldn't be surprising at all if creatures we do not know about could exist in some of those remote areas. Nothing would surprise me. The first thing I noticed as I started studying the ground, which was fortunately quite muddy from early rainfall during the week, was that there were no tiger trail markers anywhere. I could see signs of turkey, deer, rabbits, and all kinds of other creatures, and I observed all their scat in the area, which also gave me an indication of the kind of animals that had been passing through. But there definitely had been no sighting of a tiger. Suddenly I came across a muddy area that was when I stood still, barely being able to believe what I was seeing. It was a humanoid footprint in the mud that was 16 inches long and 12 feet wide, but it was clearly not from a human or even a bear. I got a good view of the big toe area, and I could see it was too splayed out to be a human's, because humans are a lot straighter because they wear shoes, and whatever this creature was, it had never known a pair of shoes in its life. I could barely believe what I was seeing, but I shrugged it off as my intention was to find the tiger markers that I was not seeing here. I was satisfied that there were no tiger trails in the area and that people had been mistaken about the predator that they thought they had heard, as there was nothing here. Suddenly I noticed everything around me went very quiet and exceedingly still. Birds were no longer chirping, and there were no other sounds. When that happens, I know as a tracker from personal experience, it usually means that a predator is around. I stood very still for a moment in deep contemplation, and then I heard the sound of something very hefty and heavy walking through the brush. But whatever this thing was, I knew it was bipedal. It was walking on 2 legs and definitely not 4. In that moment, I knew something was there. And I've experienced this gut feeling before many times as a tracker, knowing when a dangerous predator is about. It's almost like a sixth sense of just knowing instinctively, and it's inbuilt, and it's for humans to warn them of danger, and it should never be ignored. I could sense that something was watching me, and whatever it was too close for comfort, and not being able to see it was extremely unnerving because it puts you in a position of exceeding vulnerability. Predators use this tool to take advantage of their prey. I could even smell the creature, and the smell was the most unpleasant smell that I have ever smelt in my entire life. In fact, it was so revolting that I went over to the bush to throw up. Was this smell another tool, I wondered, that the creature was using to intimidate its prey, or was it just its natural body odour? As I was speculating about all of this, I suddenly heard the most awful roar, and it was not the sound of a tiger, but something that sounded even more treacherous and deadly. I promise you that my whole body almost shut down. This creature had impacted my natural human reaction by impairing my responses. I just stood there, frozen to the spot, barely being able to breathe or move. It was like my legs had grown several tons of weight in a second, and it was difficult to maneuver my body at all. No creature before has ever incapacitated me like this. No lion, no tiger, no bear. And the effects it had on me were so destabilizing. I did not know in the world what to do. But for me, this effect literally bordered on the supernatural. And to this day, I have no rational explanation for my reaction to this creature. No other predator I have ever worked with in my entire life has affected me so profoundly, both emotionally and physically. Then I saw it rushing through the thicket at me with a mock charge. I knew it was a mock charge because I'm experienced at that kind of thing. This is common behavior in the ape species, and it's designed purposely to intimidate. I could see the creature was asserting its authority towards me and making it very clear who was boss. He was behaving this way because this was his territory. I could not believe what I was seeing because I've never seen an animal like this before. You could be forgiving for believing that this was a man dressed in a ghillie suit, but it was way too big to be a human. It was about 7 feet in height and easily 550 pounds. I would say the girth of this chest was 3.5 feet wide. The creature looked as if he did indeed possess both primate and human DNA. It had a very long, elongated skull, like many of the ancient skulls that have been recovered in the past of what some believe belonged to the Nephilim. I would not be surprised if those were the skulls from these Bigfoot creatures. It is a conical head. Its conical head sat on massive shoulders, and it had a long, hairless face with a very distinctive brow ridge and big brown eyes with a very flat nose. It also had very long arms that are a distinctive attribute of the ape species, and I knew this was the creature who had made those large footprints in the mud. There was no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. As I stood there, I became as submissive as I could. That's what I would do if I was standing in front of a great ape. I did not challenge him, nor did I raise my rifle in his direction. Believe me, this creature was exceedingly intelligent, and he would know what my rifle was. And the last thing I wanted to do was to accelerate his anger and make him even more impulsive and reactive. That could potentially be fatal for me. I appealed to the humanness in this creature, which is there, believe it or not, buried beneath all those layers of angry, volatile and reactions. And especially in this creature who was, in no doubt, an alpha male. I diverted my eyes from the creature and played a very submissive role as possible, which is what I would have done if an ape were threatening me. I walked backwards slowly, facing the creature, but looking downwards, and I do believe he calmed down almost immediately. He grunted to himself and chattered away, as if he was finally satisfied that I imposed no threat and that I wasn't going to be staying for long, and then he just walked away just like that. As you can imagine, I could not believe what I had witnessed, and I do not know what the creature was. I had heard of the abominable snowman before, and that is what I thought this creature must be, until years later I was to discover it was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, Some might even call him the abominable snowman anyway. In my profession, there are lots of disbelievers about this creature, so I have not shared my encounter with anyone I know. But when I heard about this anonymous forum, I decided that my secret could come out of its secret box, buried away in the memory files of my mind that have been marked declassified for so long. For many of you animal lovers out there wanting to know what happened to Molly the tiger, well, I'm glad to tell you that we did finally track her down, and I think she was very happy to return to her home, where she was welcomed in with open arms by her loving owners. I would say that as lovely as this domestic tiger is, it still did have the potential to be dangerous. So I hope they survived little Molly, or rather the big tiger. I hope you and your listeners enjoyed my story. Well, Wayne, I just want to say thank you for sending your amazing story tonight. I think the listeners will find it so fascinating. I know that I did. I was very impressed by your story and how you reacted to that predator. And I truly believe that if you had pulled out your rifle, I think that you might not be here today. I truly think that you calmed the creature down because you understood the natural reaction of a primate towards a human being that might be a threat to its environment. We are going to be talking about Mothman, and I wonder how many of you are pondering whether this creature could be real. The question is asked by so many around this world of ours, where there have been so many humanoid sightings of winged creatures, and especially in the Mount Pleasant area and around Braxton County, where there have been so many incredible encounters with this creature. So I've got a wonderful story for you tonight from a newspaper reporter at the time who was reporting all this exciting phenomenon. So let's get started. I know you're going to enjoy the story. Dear Sarah, in 1967, I was living in my first little house, a cute little bungalow near the town of Mount Pleasant, and I did a number of reports on the various sightings of a creature known as Mothman that were seen in and around the area. I was a young girl at the time, working for a newspaper as a trainee reporter, hoping to become a fully fledged journalist one day. At the time, I was doing most of the menial junior tasks in the office. However, one of the journalists asked me to go out to visit the various individuals who claimed to have had sightings of the strange, monstrous bird-like creature. It was clear that the sightings of this winged beast had sent waves of dread around the whole community of Mount Pleasant and the surrounding areas. Little did I know at the time that I would also end up having a harrowing encounter with the feathery beast myself that would leave me with ultimately more questions than answers. The very large question around the town at the time was, what on earth was this thing? People had so many different ideas as to what it could be. Some people believed it was just a case of misidentification and that the witnesses that had encountered this creature had mistaken it, and it really was just a sandhill crane or even an owl-like creature. However, my research clearly differed, as the people I questioned were adamant about what they had seen and were clearly traumatized by the harrowing ordeal that even months after the event left them shaking and trembling in their boots. Even though the witness descriptions differed from each other from time to time, maybe because this winged creature could possibly have shape-shifting capabilities, the general consensus, however, of opinion was that this bipedal bird-like creature was between 6 to 9 feet tall, with a very low slung head, giant-like black wings, and hypnotic glowing red eyes. One witness was to describe the red colour of those eyes as not of this world. I was so thrilled as a junior trainee to be doing all this interesting research for the small little newspaper which I worked for, which for me was the most exciting thing to do, So much better than the usual boring political stories and scandals I was so used to writing about that were so much less interesting. Many of the physical sightings of Mothman did happen around the time of the Silver Bridge collapse, and many people believe that the sighting of this bird-like monster before the terrible accident was a harbinger of doom and a clear warning of the impending dreadful fate soon to strike the town and almost tear the fabric of the community wide apart. On the day of the Silver Bridge collapse, it was rush hour with bumper-to-bumper traffic, and it was a freezing, icy cold day, very close to Christmas. It was at 5 p.m. on the 15th of December 1967 when this imposing, statuesque landmark of the Silver Bridge that majestically graced the Ohio River since the dawn of its construction in 1928 was suddenly shaken to its core in a matter of seconds, and cars and people on the bridge were flung into the watery depths of this vicious, icy and cold grave. Sadly, about 46 people that day were to lose their lives. It was a horrendous day, and it was with stoic resignation that the people of Mount Pleasant faced the dreadful reality of having to come to terms with this heinous and despicable tragedy. Most people in the town knew of someone on that bridge who had so sadly lost their lives on that bitterly cold day in mid-November that was never to be forgotten. I interviewed a young couple who had a sighting of the Mothman that had many tongues wagging as to the strange origins of this curious creature. The couple claimed to have been parked on a farmer's field and were enjoying the view of the glorious Milky Way and pointing out various stars in the night sky. It was such a beautiful, tranquil night, and the couple were enjoying the serene moment of magical intimacy they were sharing together, when very suddenly the female occupant in the car noticed a light on the right-hand side. This light finally flooded the car with an intense brightness that was almost surreal. In shock, the couple revved up the engine and drove away from the scene as fast as they could, but a large metallic disc dotted with yellow downlighters on its rim hovered in the sky behind them, and the female occupant of the car was to see a tall, winged, humanoid-looking creature with wings extended backwards flying under the craft. She was to declare that this was one of the most terrifying, surreal moments of her entire young life, a moment that she would never forget. This posed a very interesting question. Was the Mothman of extraterrestrial origin and working in allegiance with this metallic disc? Many thought this to be a high probability and were sure that the Mothman did not come from our world. Some have suggested that our world has metaphysical openings like little windows or open portals in our outer atmosphere that allow otherworldly beings to slip in and out of our reality. Then there were others who believe that the Mothman is an interdimensional being, while some suggest he may indeed be a supernatural entity or even a fallen angel from the demonic realm of hell itself. Over and over again during my research, I was to hear of all manner of encounters, too many of them to tell you about right now. People had seen this feathery beast, and many were terrified of the implications and dreadful omens the sighting for them imposed, and they were fearful that this harbinger of doom was either predicting their own imminent demise or was a messenger of impending disaster that would ultimately affect their lives one day in the future. My experience with the Mothman happened when I was meeting a gentleman at night in the TMT area, which consists of 36 acres of natural wilderness, which houses an abandoned military installation used in the World War to house explosive materials and perform various experiments, often with chemicals. Many believe that Mothman resided in this abandoned location, and the client I was to meet had seen a sighting of him at night beside a large abandoned power plant-like structure in the vicinity. "Perhaps I was crazy calling you out at night like this," he said to me, because if I ever see this thing again, it will be way too soon. I could see how edgy and frightened this poor man was. So your encounter happened around this time, I asked him. It was at exactly 10:30. What did it look like, I asked. It was huge. Must have been at least 9 feet tall and definitely not less. It was a humanoid. It had visible arms and legs, but was covered almost in like this downy, feathery looking stuff, and had a low head, very much like an owl, with the hugest red compound-like eyes that I have ever seen, and of course the most massive wingspan, so much larger than a crane or even a huge vulture. Those wings were humongous, I remember that, and boy did they flap, and the sound that they made was terrifying. So did the creature see you, I asked. Oh, yes, it did. And those eyes went right through me, almost like this thing could look through my whole life, future, present, and past, like a neat filing system, and it could even read my thoughts. It definitely had a physical energy about it that was palpable, almost like currents of electricity that go through you, because you could physically feel it. Wow, that's such an interesting story, I said. So you saw him right here. And what was he doing? I was driving along past this facility, and I saw it standing up on the building. And it got my attention straight away because it was an imposing creature, to be sure. It jumped off that building like it was jumping off a diving board into the water, only in this case it was diving into the air. And then it started to fly and follow me as I drove along, and the look it gave me through my car window turned my blood freezing cold. I thanked the gentleman and scribbled down some notes quickly, and then I watched him drive away. Poor man, I thought. He really had a harrowing ordeal with the Mothman. I got into my car, closed the door behind me, and climbed into the driving seat, placing all my reports on the opposite seat. It was getting late, and it had been a long, drawn-out day. I had not eaten anything, and hunger had finally set in, and I was looking so forward to finally getting home, putting my feet up, and having a long soak in a hot bubble bath before finally retiring to bed. I was envisaging all this when I heard the thunderous sounds of heavy wings slapping against my car, causing it to shudder and vibrate. I glanced out of my side window to see this large, shadowy black form gliding way too close to my car for comfort. And then finally it lifted higher into the air like a plane taking off until it was 20 feet high in the air. The creature was in full flight with imposing wings set back like a butterfly, and it flew with incredible grace, almost like an angel. It swiveled its head round like an owl does in my direction, and I found myself staring into those hypnotic red eyes, and they were so terrifying. It was like they went like X-ray vision going right through me, but it was a physical, electrical, palpable feeling that I cannot explain. All I can say is that this creature had a very demanding, formidable presence that was not of this world. I pressed down my accelerator hard and raced home as fast as I could, and I was praying that this creature was not following me. Oh, dear God, I begged, please don't let it be following me. Oh, God, I prayed, please, I beg you, beg you, beg you. I'll do anything, but don't let it follow me. And I'm glad to say that it did not. But my evening was spent in a terribly anxious and confused state of deep contemplation, wondering what on earth this Mothman creature meant, and whether it imposed a long-term threat over my life. Would I be one of those people that just suddenly died in precariously peculiar situations? I did not know. I was so afraid. It was not long before our newspaper was printing stories about strange UFO sightings, bizarre orbs and lights that were seen around the area and in other parts of West Virginia, and of course sightings of the Mothman himself. One day at home, I opened the door to a very skinny, pale-faced man, wearing a very dark suit, shiny black shoes, a very large bowler hat, and dark wraparound glasses that appeared to be concealing a pair of bulging eyes. I did suggest he removed his glasses, as it was dark in my home, but he insisted on keeping them on, much to my surprise. There was something off and outer-worldly about the presence of this man. I cannot put my finger on it, but he did not seem entirely human. I beckoned for him to sit on one of my large, comfortable couches, and he sat down reluctantly, sitting at the edge with his legs unusually straight and his chest unnaturally erect. And then he looked at me and said, "All these UFO reports and commentary about the Mothman has been a great concern to us, a very grave concern indeed. We are very concerned about all these UFO reports and sightings of this so-called Mothman." "A concern for who?" I asked, looking floored. "The people in the area are just loving all the stories we're writing about the creature, and they cannot get enough of it. It's all over the place. People are loving it. Why should it concern you?" "Put it this way, I would strongly advise that you stop filing all these reports, because if you don't do this, as I say, the repercussions could be of great significance to you, and I would not want to be in your shoes should that be the case." At that point, he got up and walked away, and I really sensed that I had been deeply threatened and was to keep my mouth shut, which is what I did for many long years and continue to do so right now, and one of the reasons why I have chosen to remain anonymous in this forum of yours. It would seem visitations by these strange men in black were common in our area, in Point Pleasant and all around West Virginia, and the message was the same: shut up or ship out. It really seemed like these men were of extraterrestrial origin, and the feeling was that they were potentially extremely dangerous and not to be messed with, and that feeling, among many, was unanimous. You may wonder what my own impression of Mothman is, as many have invariably asked me that very same question, despite, of course, having their own set of views on the creature. I believe he has extraterrestrial origins and is connected with UFOs and men in black. I think they are outer-worldly and can slip in and out of our reality, maybe through the envelopes over our world. Whether I'm right or wrong about the mysterious Mothman is irrelevant, but one thing is certain: he is definitely real, and he is out there, and seemingly as physical as you and me, although nobody has ever been able to strike him down, which does suggest he may be supernatural. Where he comes from and what he's doing on our planet and in our world is a question I could not answer and wish I could. Some of these humanoid creatures around the world seem very territorial and tend to be around various places, like the Owlman that is often seen in Cornwall, England. And there are, of course, Mothman sightings in West Virginia and even in Houston, Texas. And there's been sightings of the creature in Chernobyl in Russia, a site of a great disaster. Every year in the town of Mount Pleasant, there is a Mothman festival where the town is filled with so many people that are so excited and very thrilled to be there. It triples in size in the town at that time of year and attracts thousands because of the legendary sightings and more recent accounts of the somewhat elusive winged moth-like creature that we call Mothman. Well, I just want to say that is the most fascinating story about Mothman that I have ever heard. And I have to say that I do think from what it sounds like, especially since Mothman was seen flying under the silver disc. And I remember hearing a story about in 1957 when there was actually a sighting of the strange metal disc seen in a wood in West Virginia by a couple of boys. So I do think that there is a connection, and I think it probably is an extraterrestrial origin and may come through those envelopes on the atmosphere of our world. And how it slips in and out of our reality, I do not know. But I think the very fact that people have not been able to kill this elusive creature does suggest that it does have some supernatural abilities. And what it is, I have no idea. But I can't imagine how terrifying it must be to have a sighting of this creature. And if you have, and you've seen it yourself, don't be afraid, because I have heard that a lot of people are still happily around, even after having, many years later, after having even sighted this creature. But it does seem that he does seem to be around places of impending disasters. He's seen before them. So that is definitely food for thought. And it is amazing what is coming out of the woodwork. People who have been sitting on secrets for such a long time. Extraordinary stories that are absolutely unbelievable. And I have got so many of them lined up for you to listen to that you're just going to love. And those are one of the stories that I have lined up for you tonight. And so if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because you don't want to miss out on these amazing stories. And if you do happen to write a comment I don't get back to you, please don't get upset about it. It's because I have a very hectic life, and I have a puppy at the moment that is literally ripping my house to shreds and darting after the cats, and I've got lots of cats, and my dog is just being quite a nightmare, so that's very hard to control at the moment. Anyway, the story tonight comes from a lovely lady called Jeanette, who lives somewhere in North America, and she said her encounter happened in 1987, and it was because she grew up in a very, very volatile home with a very abusive mother and father who were both addicted to substances. And as a result, she couldn't wait to get out of that environment. And in doing so, she had a Bigfoot encounter. And this is what she's sharing with us today. And you are going to love the story. I know I did. So let's get started. Dear Sarah, my name is Jeanette, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the year 1987, somewhere here in North America, but I don't want to say exactly where. Let me tell you my story, though, and how I came to encounter the hairy man, otherwise known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I grew up in a very abusive household. My mother was always high on drugs, and my father was a shameless alcoholic. I was an only child, and I grew up feeling ashamed of both of my parents. I'm afraid to say they were a huge embarrassment to me. I was frightened to tell anybody what was going on in my household because I was so terrified that social services would get involved in my situation. And I truly did not fancy the idea of being one of those children that hopped from one foster home to another. I knew of situations like that, and they weren't good stories. I really believed that even though I was in a bad situation, if I went and lived in a foster home, I would be far worse off than with my dysfunctional parents. It was normal for me to come home to literally find my mother passed out on drugs, lying on the couch, completely spaced out in another world. And then my father I would find watching sports games on television in a drunken stupor. I remember that the living room became like a dumping ground for battered beer cans and leftover takeaways. It was disgusting. Sometimes I felt like I was the only adult in my house. With the money from my paper round, I would buy my own food and anything else that I might need. Otherwise, there was nothing in the house. My parents lived off state disability benefits, which they managed to claim, I don't know how. And most of these benefits were spent on alcohol and drugs. My mother was as skinny as a rake because she just took drugs and barely ever ate a thing. I sometimes wonder why she was still alive, because she was so emaciated and her skin was pale and pasty and grey, dulled by the substance abuse. She would have looked perfect playing a part on those zombie movies because she looked just like one of them, so much so in fact that she could have been given the leading part. My dad was also extremely thin and emaciated, but his stomach was the size of a pregnant woman who was expecting triplets, because his liver was so badly inflamed and he was already suffering from the early stages of cirrhosis of the liver. The side effects of this alcohol abuse made him aggressive and abusive, and sometimes even violent. And some of the nasty things he said to me are not repeatable to any of your listeners. When I would go home, I would go to my bedroom and lock the door behind me because I wanted as little contact with my parents as possible. I would always look forward to going to school and would eagerly catch the earliest bus in the morning. I remember always dreading the school holidays because it meant that I was shut in the house with two very insane parents that I hated being around. I adored my school friends and I would dread coming home from school every single day. I would literally have to pace myself before I opened the front door because I never knew what I would find. Maybe my mother would be wobbling around the house, speaking in a slurred voice, or she might even be dead. Nothing would have surprised me. I was the girl at school with the holes in my socks and wearing the faded dress that was way too short that I had outgrown a long time ago. Luckily, I had the nicest friends. They never commented about the state of my clothes or how old they were, nor did they ask me any awkward questions, but they would have been blind not to notice how impoverished I was. I envied my friends with their perfectly packed lunch boxes, their new-looking clothes, and their seemingly perfect lives. If I went to a friend's house for a birthday party or some other occasion, I was just so shocked how some people had the most wonderful lives and parents who loved and adored them and looked out for their best interests. Sometimes my friends would be mad about being grounded or something, and I would think how lucky they were to have parents who truly loved them and enough to set boundaries. Mine never cared a jot about what I did. Even though I was sad about my plight, I did not allow it to get me down or to discourage me in any way. I tried to be as resourceful as I could to make money as a young girl by offering my services to neighbours in doing odd jobs like washing cars or weeding the garden or even painting something, which they would pay me for. I would never get any money from my parents. As for my family home, it was an embarrassment and a sight to behold. I think our nearest neighbour did not like living next door to our house because it was literally falling apart, with shabby, dirty curtains and threadbare furniture, and an overgrown garden that had not seen a lawnmower for years, while their gardens, by contrast, were beautifully manicured and maintained, with perfectly mown lawns and beds of beautiful blooming flowers. I could not wait until I finally was old enough to legally leave home and get a job all of my own to support myself. When that day did finally arrive and I got a job as a waitress at a restaurant in the town that was always so busy because the food was so delicious and they were open until late in the evening, they made the best burgers in town and the most delicious smoked meat sandwiches you've ever tasted. I was so excited about my future prospects. I could not afford a place of my own, but I had learnt from a friend of mine of a house that had been recently abandoned for a pretty long while, and yet the good news was the power was still working, which was extraordinary. The house was fairly close to where I attended school, so everything looked pretty promising. I was so desperate to leave my home and all that unhappiness and desperate loneliness behind me that I had felt growing up. I decided that I would move into this abandoned house and clean it up as much as I possibly could until I could finally afford to rent out my own place. In other words, I was about to become a squatter, I suppose, a word I've never liked. I took a trip in a bus that stopped almost yards away from the abandoned house that I hadn't visited before. I had left a note for my parents telling them that I had left home for good and had no intention of coming back, and that I hoped they had great lives. I doubt that they would have even cared that I had left or even noticed that much for that matter. All I had with me was a bag of cleaning products, a little food, and a suitcase filled with second-hand clothing that I'd recently bought from a thrift shop, which was a much better upgrade than any of my old clothes. When I arrived at the property, I was shocked by how overgrown it was. I wasn't expecting it to be this bad. It truly was a rambling thicket of vegetation that had definitely seen better days. There were lots of trees on the property that ended up becoming more uniform towards the northern side, looking like it bordered out into a larger wooded area. The surrounding valleys and countryside in the distance were all densely forested, and I knew that there were lakes, streams, and plentiful wildlife in the area, from white-tailed deers to hogs and the usual predators that you get in these parts. The house was a very long bungalow that was spacious, but a lot of the furniture had been removed, but there still were odds and ends lying around the place that had clearly belonged to the previous owner. The house was big enough for a whole family, but I just got the impression it had belonged to a single man, and I could not help wondering why he had left and abandoned this lovely home of his. I saw an old photograph of a gentleman in a frame that lay upside down on the floor, and I picked it up and looked at it, imagining that this was the man who had once owned the house. The picture was that of a handsome-looking man in his early 30s who appeared to be wearing tennis shoes and holding a racket in his hands. I really got the impression that he looked like a nice bloke who was a little bit on the shy side. The kitchen area was extremely impressive and looked almost new, with its fancy wooden cupboards, central island, and fancy gas hob. When I went to the main room, where there was no furniture at all, as if the whole room had been cleared out completely, so much so in fact that I swear I could smell the telltale signs of heavy-duty cleaning materials that still lingered in the air. Suddenly I felt this awful sense of foreboding, and I just knew instinctively that something remarkably bad had happened here. But what it was, I couldn't say. Then I saw it. The very thing that confirmed my worst nightmare about this bedroom. On an area of floor, marking what I imagine was where a dead body had once lain, were the telltale signs of that yellow tape with black writing saying crime scene. I could see what appeared to be an area on the wooden floor that almost looked like a stain from what may have been a decomposing body or maybe a blood stain of some kind. I did not know. I also found a piece of paper that may have been written by a medical examiner or a police officer lying on the floor. Most of the note I did not understand, but there was one sentence that got my attention almost immediately, and it said, "large laceration to the side of the neck." I knew that something bad had transpired in this house, and that someone had clearly been murdered. But why was the house still abandoned? In that moment, I did feel that sense of impending doom and desire to leave this place almost at once. But no matter how tarnished this place may be, I just knew that going home was not an option for me. You would think I would just get back on the bus and go back home, but you would need to understand how desperate I was to get away from my awful parents. I had dreamt of this day for so long, and I was not about to give up on my dreams, not even now. Even though someone was murdered on this premises, nothing was going to stop me from making this a roof over my heads for the next few months, until I had saved enough money to rent out my own place. I just closed the crime scene room and decided never to venture in there ever again. But I spent the next few days cleaning the rest of the house. I scrubbed the whole place from top to bottom until my hands ached with pain. I cleaned windows and washed floors and hoovered carpets because the electrics were still working. The place was beginning to feel more like a home, and it was a wonderful feeling to be away from my parents, and for the first time in my life, I began to feel free. One day while I was busy cleaning, I heard a young girl sobbing outside. She was sitting on the front porch, and I did not know whether to go out and comfort her or to remain hidden inside the abandoned house. I had no idea who she was or what she was doing on the property, and I did wonder why she was crying. Eventually I decided to go out onto the wooden deck to comfort the girl who was sitting on one of the steps. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I just heard you crying." "I suppose I am what you..." The girl looked startled. "Who are you?" she asked. "I suppose I'm what you might call a squatter," I said. "I'm kind of living here." "Are you kidding?" she said, wiping away her tears. "You do know what happened here." "Someone was murdered, you know." "Well," I said, "I did see some crime tape in the bedroom, so I guess someone had been found dead here." The girl looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face. "You would live in a place like this after knowing that someone was killed violently here?" she asked. I was surprised by my own frank response. "Well, I'm desperate," I exclaimed. "You must be," said the girl, looking at me startled. "You'd have to pay me to live in Uncle Matt's home after what happened to him." "Was this your Uncle Matt's home?" I asked in surprise. "Was it him who died in that room?" The girl nodded, and then she burst into uncontrollable sobs. "Get it all out," I said to her, cradling her into my arms and stroking her back. "Crying is the best way to heal," I told her. After the girl stopped sobbing, she looked up at me and said, "Why him of all people? He was the nicest person I have ever known. Who would want to do such an evil thing to him?" "I saw his picture," I said. "He looked like an incredibly nice guy." "I found him, you know," said the girl. "I always popped in to see him once or twice a week." The girl proceeded to tell me how the front door had been taken off its hinges, almost as if it had been yanked off by some violent force. "The police have never seen anything like this before," she exclaimed. "They said the break-ins do not happen like this." She proceeded to tell me how she knew when she saw the front door on the ground that something quite dreadful had happened to her uncle. He had only been dead for 4 hours when I found him, but the smell in that room was intolerable. I never knew a dead body could smell like a skunk. It was disgusting. Anyway, she continued, I rushed into his room and he was lying on the ground, motionless. I knew he was dead. His neck was broken with a huge gash on the side. "Wow," I said, "that's terrible. I'm so sorry for your loss." "I came here today," said the girl, "to make sense of everything, and of course to remember him, to be close to him, because this is where I spent time with him." "Of course you did," I said. "I'll get out of your way." "Please don't," the girl begged. "It's good to talk to someone about this." "Did your uncle say anything about any enemies?" I asked her curiously. "Maybe someone who wanted to do him grievous bodily harm?" "Can I tell you something weird?" she said. "In the strictest of confidence, of course." "Of course," I said. "Go on. I'm all ears." "Well, I don't know how to say this, and I know it's going to sound very strange, but it's really true. There was this very large man on the property once. I was with my uncle when I saw him. We both actually saw him. The only thing about him was that he was much, much bigger than a man would be. I've never seen a man that big. And he was covered with short black hair. We both saw him watching us from the tree line over there, and he was like a savage. He looked menacing and very, very scary, like an apex predator. He had this strange conical head and very long arms compared to ours. He also thumped his chest in front of us very aggressively, as if to tell us, I'm boss, not you. And he made this deep guttural sound, which was the most terrifying sound that either my uncle and I had ever heard. "Did you tell the police about this?" I asked. "I tried to, but when I did, they just laughed at me, as if they thought I was making it all up. I want to find the killer as much as they do, but they didn't take me seriously at all." "Oh dear," I said, "that's terrible." "Did you ever see the big hairy man again?" I asked. "No, but my uncle saw him from time to time, and he said things were getting seriously out of hand with the creature. He said that horrible hairy man had been banging his house and even throwing boulders at his front door and got him feeling incredibly intimidated." "Are you sure about this?" I asked in horror, wondering whether squatting at this property was such a good idea after all. "You haven't seen any sightings of this hairy man again?" she asked me. "I'm willing to bet that he killed my uncle, and if he's still round, You could also be in danger. You realise that? I mean, this thing was a monster, and I'm not kidding you about that. I don't know if you're actually safe here. She started to hand me a bottle of mace. I brought it along in case I had any nasty encounters of my own, she said. But I think if you're going to be staying here, you're going to need it more than I do. I took the bottle of mace from the girl gratefully. You will come back, I asked. I've really enjoyed our chat. The girl nodded, and I watched her walk away. What an extraordinary story, I thought. 3 weeks passed by in the abandoned house, and I was thrilled that the electric still had not been cut off. It was wonderful leaving my parents and living all on my own. I had been saving a lot of money, and things were going exceedingly well for me. Every night after my waitressing stint, I would return home at about 12 o'clock and was given a lift by one of the waitresses that worked with me, who had her own car. One evening as I returned to the abandoned house, I sensed that something was watching me, and whatever it was incredibly unsettling. Suddenly I detected a movement in the brush of this dark, shadowy form with bright red eyes, at least 7 feet off the ground. I ran into the house and immediately bolted the doors and windows from the inside. Luckily, even the keys of the house were lying around, and the front door had long since been fixed, so at least I knew I was safely secure on the inside of the house. The thing, whatever it was, came thundering through the tree line like a bulldozer, and I could hear his heavy feet walking across the roof. He was making the most horrendous growls that were so terrifying I nearly jumped through my skin. My heart was pounding, and I could do nothing to call for help because there were no phones on the property, and in those days we didn't have cell phones accessible to us. I've never felt so vulnerable and so afraid in all of my life, and I could hear this thing banging and pounding the front door, and suddenly I heard the hinge breaking, and I knew that this thing was after me. He would be in the house in seconds, and I knew I was in grave danger of losing my life. I remember that there was a bathroom window in the back that I believed I was slim enough to slide through, and so that is what I did. It is amazing what you can do when you are in grave danger. I suddenly heard the front door breaking off its hinges, and by that time I'd slipped out of the house as quietly as I could. I ran into the main road, and I was fortunate enough to flag down a passing driver, which was a miracle because it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there were not many drivers out on the roads that late at night. The stranger asked me no awkward questions and proceeded to drop me at my parents' house. I kid you not, when I walked back into my family home, my parents barely acknowledged me, barely asked where I'd been, and did not even realize, I think, that I'd been living away from that home for several weeks. I never even returned to the abandoned house ever again, nor did I ever see the lovely niece of the deceased Uncle Matt. I had left all my minimal belongings in the house, including all my savings, but I knew I would never go back to get them. I'm convinced that it was the creature killed the owner of the abandoned house, which I believe was a territorial Bigfoot who did not want anyone on the property. When he got a whiff of my presence, he was after me too, and I have no doubt that he would have killed me if he had got hold of me. I was so lucky to escape with my life, and for that I am truly grateful. It took me 2 long years to finally move out of my parents' house, but eventually within months of each other, they both died because of their addictive behaviours. My mother died of substance overdose, and my father eventually succumbed to cirrhosis of the liver. I'm happily married now with children of my own, and I truly cannot understand why my parents were so irresponsible and so incredibly uncaring. But I have forgiven them, as I have that hairy man, for attempting to harm me, because in my experience, carrying grudges can poison you very much and cause you too much grief in your own life. And I wanted to move on from all of that. So there you are. That's my story. Jeanette, I know that this is a very hard story for you have to shared with anyone tonight. I cannot imagine what it must have been to actually move into a crime scene home and consider that preferable where someone's being murdered than staying with your own parents. That really does bring to light how awful it is to live with people who are addicted to substances like alcohol and drugs. I cannot imagine what you went through as a young girl, and I truly applaud you for your incredible courage. And I just thank you so much also for having the incredible courage to send us this amazing story that really tugs at the heartstrings.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.